Since the 80s, dogs have been used to sniff out damaging pests and their vectors of entry into the United States, primarily at airports. This team of dogs and their handlers is known as the Beagle Brigade, but over the years, this method of pest detection has spread out from airports and now uses different kinds of dogs for multiple insect problems. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Please like and subscribe, it helps the channel grow. If you'd like to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description. And if you do, you can always make a request for a specific topic you would like to hear about on the channel. Thanks. Today I wanted to talk about some research that recently came out from Virginia Tech about using dogs to help locate spotted lanternfly egg masses in order to slow the spread of this invasive and destructive pest. For those of you who aren't super familiar with these, one, you're probably not located in the eastern United States, but these are a pest from China, which showed up, I believe, back in 2014, and they have spread at this point to cover most of the eastern United States. I believe they're recorded in now 18 states, expanding as far west at this point as Illinois and as far south as Georgia. And they generally have a fairly strong host range, although they are preferential feeders on tree of heaven, which is another pestilent plant. They tend to congregate in large numbers in people's gardens, especially on, the more juicy plants like cucumbers and squashes and melons, things like that. But industrially, they're a bigger problem for fruit growers, especially grape growers for wine production. So this is a serious concern for areas where the wine industry is large. So you're talking about Maryland and Virginia and New York and New Jersey, but they are overall just incredibly annoying. The use of dogs for finding pests is a pretty common practice, and you may be familiar with, scent finding dogs if you're talking about missing people or drug smelling dogs, but USDA and Customs and Border Protection have used dogs for a long time, for at least 40 years, in order to detect invasive pests or pests of concern. This is most commonly seen in airports, where you might see the Beagle Brigade, which are beagles that are trained specifically to find fruit and vegetables in people's luggage or packaged meats, stuff like that. You'll see this more in the international terminals in U.S. airports, but you will occasionally see them in domestic terminals, especially in areas like Hawaii and Puerto Rico. But USDA, CBP, and state agricultural agencies have used this for a number of other pests as well. One of the more successful versions of this dog finds pest protocol was used in Miami and the surrounding area in order to locate the giant African snail. These were brought in multiple times over the years. Most recently, they were brought in what is thought to be Santeria practices, in which people would consume the liquid inside the shell of the giant African snail. This resulted in the deaths of multiple children and eventually FBI involvement, because not only were these animals being trafficked into the country, but it turns out that these groups were also trafficking people. So there was a lot of hoopla about this, and these snails were being reared at members' homes for the Santeria group, and then eventually they escaped into the wild, and dogs were used to sniff out these snails overnight, because generally the snails are only active nocturnally. Another pest that was somewhat successfully controlled using this dog detection model was the Asian longhorn beetle. And the Asian longhorn beetle is another Asian pest which showed up in the northeastern United States, predominantly in New York and Boston, and then there were other pockets of this as far west as Ohio, in which dogs were trained in order to smell trees which were infested with these longhorn beetles. And this was actually a pretty good control program. It's still ongoing. Generally, the control of this beetle requires the complete removal and destruction of the infested trees, so it's a very time-consuming control method, but overall it's been pretty successful in the states which had infestations.
The mission is to try to allocate resources to the areas that the dogs are responding or showing indications in. The dogs are trained using positive reinforcement to respond. They already know that something's different, and what we're doing is teaching them to tell us when there's something present there. So all we're basically doing is using their natural instinct to hunt and capitalizing on that, and then telling them what kind of response we want them to show us when they do indicate this. Everything revolves around the dog's nose, hunting-wise, whereas the human, we mainly focus on our eyes. Everything is revolved around our eyes.
But as far as spotted lanternfly goes, these dogs are being trained to locate the egg masses, which is great because the egg masses are the predominant way that these insects tend to be spread. The egg masses end up generally on tiles or stone or lumber, and this is what they look like. They basically just look like smeared mud. So humans tend to not notice them, and so you end up with these egg masses crossing state lines really easily, and this has fueled the spread. Another problem with dealing with these egg masses is that we don't really know of any natural predators that will destroy the egg masses. We are familiar with animals that will eat the nymphs and the adults of the spotted lanternfly, but the egg masses, because they are coated in this kind of muddy, waxy substance, they don't really receive any sort of predation or parasite pressure. So it's really important that we can destroy them in order to limit the spread. So with these dogs, these are generally sports dogs, so hunting dogs and retrievers and things like that, and they are being trained to detect the smell of the egg masses. And this was done by basically killing some spotted lanternfly egg masses, which were collected from the wild, and then training the dogs specifically on that scent. In this case, multiple teams of dogs were trained, and they were taught odor recognition for the egg masses in a controlled environment, and those dogs which were successful were then passed along to a field examination trial in which they had to look around outside for egg masses, and then eventually whether or not they passed or failed meant that they would be allowed to do this as a control measure. This is generally what an indoor odor recognition test looked like. One of these boxes here would be containing an egg mass and the others would be empty. And could the dogs detect where the egg mass was? And if they passed this test, then they would be taken out into an area like this, where an egg mass has been hidden somewhere and the dogs have to find it. And generally speaking, if a dog passed both of these tests, they were really good at finding egg masses in the wild. So this requires quite a bit of training and a quite intelligent dog, but overall it's still better than a human trying to find it, because if you're out there looking for this kind of muddy mass out in the wild, you're probably going to miss it, whereas dogs had a pretty good detection rate. Overall, they managed like a 50% detection rate, which is way better than human visual detection. But in some cases, for these dogs that passed all of the tests and then were allowed to go look in the wild, they generally had like something like an 80% positive detection rate. So the more exposure they had and the more intelligent the animal, the better the detection rate. So this is something that we can do long term in order to help slow the spread of this. At this point, there's no getting rid of the spotted lanternfly. It's already too widespread. We're now at this point looking at limiting the spread westward and also limiting impact through things like biological control programs or better pesticide programs, things like that. And then, homeowner property management programs. So remove tree of heaven from your property if you have it, because that seems to be where the majority of the pressure comes from and it spills over into other plants. Peel egg masses off your trees in the fall and in the winter so that you don't have such a high population come the spring, things like that. So at this point, we're past eradication. That's not going to work. So with something like the giant African snail infestation in Miami, the dogs were deployed very, very early, and this allowed for an eradication. But at this point, the spotted lanternfly is just too widespread. So with that, I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks for watching.